here at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. This is the fourth of 6 Black Studies speaker series who are contributing to our Black Study Within and Beyond Crisis working group that makes space for UL students, faculty, and staff to more critically engage the work of Black study and the field of Black studies. To begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the UL College of Liberal Arts, the UL English Department, and UL Department of History, Geography, and Philosophy, as well as the Gilbo Charitable Trust. I also want to thank my colleagues, Drs. Maria Seeger and Ian Beamish, for their work coordinating and supporting this opportunity. I also want to thank our undergraduate research assistant, Connor Benoit, for his work coordinating as well. I will now read a brief land acknowledgement drafted by my colleague, Dr. Marissa Petro, and First Nations group in the Louisiana area. Dr. Petro is the director of the Gilbo Center for Public History. UL Lafayette is on the land of the Atakapa Ishak, and we honor the Atakapa Ishak and the land with gratitude. We would also like to express our gratitude to elders past, present, and future of the dozens of other First Nations in the Louisiana area, including the Chitimacha, Appaloosa, Abigel, Tunica Biloxi, Jena Choctaw, Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, and Coushatta. We also honor the peoples of African descent who were enslaved on this land when it was part of the Mouton family's sugar plantation. The center's full land acknowledgement can be found at www.gilbocenter.com/honor-native-land. I'm now going to read just a brief description of why we're here and the working group's purpose, and why we've invited Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly. Black studies emerged within the university as a product of an institutional crisis with the ongoing condition of unfreedom for Black students, community, and life in 1969. As an interdisciplinary field of study, it has been subject to much evolution over the past half century. New ruptures in the field require a revaluation of the role of the university, the academic, and the socio-political terrain that Black studies must navigate. Against the backdrop of a pandemic, the uprisings of summer 2020, and renewed institutional calls for anti-racist reforms, what is the function of critical knowledge production toward the liberation of Black people? How can Black studies meaningfully meet the imperatives of education in communities under crisis? Why is it important to think of Black studies, life, and culture beyond crisis? The Critical Speaker Series and Working Group in Black Studies takes a broad interdisciplinary look at the challenges confronting the work of the humanities under multiple crises. Scholars and artists will introduce the UL community to recent scholarship in the field through their writings and virtual engagement. The working group will make space for students, staff, and faculty to read and discuss recommended selections by the speakers prior to their presentations. We did last Friday with Dr. Burden-Stelly, had a very lively conversation from 2 articles that she published in 2017 and 2019. We can share those with folk who email us afterwards if you want to read them. The purpose of the space is not to contribute to the spectacular and profitable representation of Black life as crisis, but to understand how critical tools of analysis distinct to Black study and Black critical thought can create new avenues to rupture the enduring relation of slavery's afterlife to the modern world. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Maria Seeger, who will introduce our esteemed speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Theo, and thanks everyone for being here. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly. She is the 2020-2021 Visiting Scholar in the Race and Capitalism Project at the University of Chicago. And she's currently Assistant Professor of Africana Studies and Political Science at Carleton College. A scholar of critical Black studies, political theory, political economy, and intellectual history. She is the co-author with Gerald Horne of W.E.B. Du Bois, A Life in American History. She is also currently working on a book manuscript titled Black Scare, Red Scare, Anti-Blackness, Anti-Communism, and the Rise of Capitalism in the United States. She is the co-editor of the forthcoming Organize, Fight, Win, 3 Decades of Black Communist Women's Political Writings with Jody Dean. Her published work appears in journals including Small Axe, Souls, Du Bois Review, Socialism and Democracy, International Journal of Africana Studies, and the CLR James Journal. Her public scholarship can be found in venues including Monthly Review, Boston Review, and Black Perspectives. She is a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Coordinating Committee and the host of the Last Dope Intellectual podcast, which is part of the Black Power Media Network. with that being said, welcome, Dr. Burden-Stelly. We're so pleased to have you. We can't wait to hear your talk. Theo, I think you have to make Dr. Burden-Stelly a co-host so she can unmute herself.
Thank you. Hold on, let me get the security. And let me make. My sincere apologies. Can you unmute now? Boom.
No worries. You know, we got.
I'm the old person in the room, I guess now.
Lockdown. Thank you so much for that introduction. And let me just say, I really appreciate that the ways in which the land acknowledgement also acknowledged African labor. Like, that's always missing, and I'm so glad that it was there. So big ups. Thank you to the Black Study Within and Beyond Crisis Working Group at the University of Louisiana Lafayette for inviting me to speak this afternoon. The title of my talk is Black Studies, Black Struggle, Black Liberation. And I just want to say a little bit about why I am focused on this topic. So first and foremost, I am classically trained in Black Studies. That means I have my BA, my MA, and my PhD in Black Studies. So I'm very invested in the field. I police it quite a lot. And I have a very particular understanding of what is and is not Black Studies. And I'm very critical of people who claim to be Black Studies scholars, but don't engage with scholarship emanating from the field, people who are hostile to hiring people with PhDs in Black Studies, and these sorts of contradictions. And so the other thing, in grad school, I took a course with a professor called Hardy Fry about Black Studies as a field. And so often we don't study the fields in which we're trained as a field. And so that really gave me a sense of how our field is very unique in terms of its development. So unlike the sort of so-called traditional disciplines which developed in relationship to like colonialism and Western forms of knowledge production, Black studies and other forms of ethnic studies and interdisciplinary studies came about as a challenge to those forms of knowing, and also through social movements, which is very, very unique. And also the reason why Black studies is constantly under attack, right? And constantly under the question of whether or not it is a legitimate field of study. And then I began to think about Black studies in terms of why there's a dearth of critical political economy in our field. So that is partially what my dissertation focused on. And so that got me to interrogating the effects of institutionalization and professionalization, one of which is anti-Marxism and a move away from structural and material analysis. And so part of my project is to bring that focus back to Black studies and to think about Black studies as a liberatory project, and to talk about Black studies as a form of struggle to the end of Black liberation. And so that is sort of what I'll focus on today. I'm giving kind of a historical talk, ending with some queries as to, why we are on the trajectory that we are currently. So I understand the Black studies movement in the United States, which burgeoned in 1968, in relationship to earlier and contemporaneous Pan-African and Third Worldist struggles to eradicate forms of domination, including capitalist imperialism, colonialism and neocolonialism, white supremacy and Eurocentrism, and war and nuclear proliferation. Such insurgencies were manifested in, for example, the 1945 Pan-African Congress, the 1955 Asian African Conference, commonly known as the Bandung Conference, and the 1966 Solidarity Conference of the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, commonly known as the Tri-continental Conference. The drive for Black studies offered similar critiques of oppression by students who positioned themselves as third world subjects in their demands for a more relevant education. So in terms of the 1945 Pan-African Congress, influenced by the World Trade Union and subject peoples conferences held earlier that year, the Fifth Pan-African Congress, which met in Manchester, England, signaled a militant phase of anti-colonialism, emphasizing the right of all colonized nations to be self-determining, self-governing, and to control their own destinies. And so I'll just mention here that there were previous Pan-African Congresses, 1900, 1919, 1921, 1923, and 1927. But this was by far the most militant. Participants insisted upon emancipation for the whole of the Black world. They demanded the complete and absolute independence of West Africa, the removal of armed forces from and democratic rights in North Africa, and that the principles of the Atlantic Charter and the Four Freedoms be put into practice in East Africa. They passed resolutions supporting the voluntary federation of the British West Indies predicated on self-government, universal adult suffrage, and the introduction of modern social legislation afforded to citizens in the metropoles. They also supported defense against imperial imposition upon Haitian and Ethiopian sovereignty and made a case for representation of colonized and oppressed people in the United Nations. While the Pan-African Congress included participation from prominent intellectuals, activists, and future heads of state, including Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, Ross T. McConan, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Nnamdi Azikiwe, and of course, W.E.B. Du Bois and George Padmore, delegates emphasized that peasants, workers, and the laboring classes were the key actors in throwing off colonialism and imperialism. Their declaration to the colonial workers, farmers, and intellectuals insisted that the strike and the boycott, along with struggles to form trade unions and cooperatives, were essential tools for liberation. Like later Black and Third World internationalist meetings, the Fifth Pan-African Congress included an explicit excoriation of capitalism and the rule of profit for undermining democracy, freedom, and peace. It also condemned foreign imperialist control for exploiting and dispossessing indigenous populations and white supremacist oppression for its impediment to the flourishing of racialized populations. Participants expressed their solidarity with other third world populations by sending greetings to the masses of India struggling for national freedom and social emancipation, to Indonesia and Vietnam who are fighting for national freedom and economic emancipation from Dutch and French imperialism, and to the Black folks in the United States for their heroic struggle for full citizenship and the equitable distribution of wealth and resources. In turn, a message to the Congress from India emphasized the common struggles between Indian and African people. These exchanges were a harbinger for the development of Afro-Asian solidarity, the tri-continental inclusion of Latin America and US Black struggles into the global anti-imperial movement, and the deterritorialized enunciation of third world liberation in the Black studies movement. So here we see elements of the coming Black studies struggle, not least the demand for self-determination and the ways in which struggles in a particular locality are linked to struggles throughout the Black world and also throughout the third world more broadly. And this is a key feature of the Black studies movement. The Bandung Conference held from April 18th through 22nd, 1955 in Bandung, Indonesia, is one of the best examples of Afro-Asian solidarity that not only asserted newly independent nations as a force in the international community, but that also explicitly challenged white supremacy and Euro-American domination. The conference was planned by the governments of India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Burma, and Ceylon, and 24 nations, including Japan, China, the Gold Coast, and the Central African Federation, the latter two, which were still British colonies, were invited to participate. The entire American continent and the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies were excluded because the conference was specifically focused on building solidarity between and self-determination in African and Asian countries. As the first conference that explicitly excluded European participation, it aimed to build a sustained campaign against imperialism, colonialism, and white supremacy, and to emphasize nation building, geopolitical autonomy, and world peace. The meeting of anti-colonial, anti-racist, colored nations presented a challenge to the United States, which had become the new global hegemon, given its abysmal racial record, its direct and indirect support of European colonialism, and its practices of colonization in the South Pacific and in the Caribbean. The United States rightfully feared that the effective mobilization of the color line would provide a counterweight to its domination in the world system, compromise its standing in the decolonizing world, and foment anti-Western and anti-American geopolitical strategy. The influence of the Soviet Union was likewise rejected. Indeed, the Bandung Conference sought to cultivate a locus of power and leadership independent of the United States, the West, and the Soviet Union that will ultimately lead to economic and political autonomy predicated upon the cooperation of Africa and Asia. Participants understood that colonialism, imperialism, and exogenous economic formations that disregarded historical and material specificities undermined independence. Hence, interracial and international anti-colonial and anti-racist cooperation were vital. It was at the Bandung Conference that the idea of the third world began to consolidate across political, ideological, and geographic geographic differences. As the writer Richard Wright observed, the conference did not align with left or right politics, nor was it an episode in Cold War politics or a communist front. Developing a strategy for cooperation, self-determination, and economic development was more important than ideology. In the Declaration on the Promotion of World Peace and Cooperation, delegates agreed that, quote, the right of self-determination must be enjoyed by all peoples, and freedom and independence must be granted with the least possible delay to those who are still dependent peoples. Indeed, all nations should have the right freely to choose their own political and economic system and their own way of life, end quote. The meeting inaugurated the emergence of the Bandung era, in which the Third World would become a significant player in international relations. It signaled an international order in which race and color became important sources of power, political alignment, and solidarity. So again, we see here the ways in which racialized people are trying to forge their own way. And this is also what is being articulated in Black and ethnic studies in the 1960s. And you know, the students who are struggling in the Black studies and ethnic studies movements are very much building on this Bandung spirit, right? Tri-continentalism was arguably the most important discourse of the second Bandung era, in which Afro-Asian solidarity expanded to include Latin America. It was a monumental effort to forge a new political terrain built upon various iterations and combinations of anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and anti-colonialism, including revolutionary nationalism, non-alignment, third worldism, and Black power. Now, I want to point out here, this is not the anti-racism that has become popular currently. This is anti-imperialist, anti-racism. This is anti-capitalist, counter-hegemonic anti-racism, not anti-racism that is about white folks' feelings. So just gonna throw that out there. This formation eschewed nonviolence, instead promoting guerrilla warfare, armed struggle, hemispheric revolution, and liberation by any means necessary. Characteristic of this moment was Fidel Castro's Solidarity Conference of the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, commonly known as the Tri-Continental Conference, that convened in Havana, Cuba, starting on January 3rd, 1966. More than 500 representatives from national liberation movements, guerrilla organizations, and independent governments of some 82 countries gathered to forge a radical internationalist challenge to both the United States hegemony and the Soviet Union's policy of peaceful coexistence. So what's really interesting and really important about the Tri-Continental Conference vis-a-vis the Bandung Conference is that it included groups that were not simply heads of state. These were groups who had not gained independence, but were guerrilla groups struggling against, like, engaged in armed struggle against colonial powers. So it was more radical in that regard. And most of the groups who were in attendance at the Tri-Continental Conference were, in fact, leftist or socialist groups. Three general themes pervaded the Tri-Continental Conference. First, attendees supported revolutionary nationalism as an essential phase of the struggle against colonialism, underdevelopment, capitalist imposition, and political disenfranchisement. However, while nationalist ideology was recognized as an essential tool for the formation of a militant liberation front, it was stressed that the nationalist phase was neither a final solution nor a sufficient means of combating political, economic, or technical exploitation. These maladies could best be resolved by the second theme, tri-continental coordination, solidarity, and mutual comradeship. It was only through such unity that imperialism and foreign imposition could be eradicated, that neocolonialism could be revealed, combated, and ultimately eliminated, and that modes of development endogenous to and beneficial for the formerly colonized could be theorized and implemented. Third, those in attendance overwhelmingly agreed that socialism and third world liberation were inextricable. Here, socialism meant common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, production for use instead of profit, state planning, the cultivation of scientific and modern methods of industry and agriculture, and political power and governance controlled by the people generally, and workers particularly. In the final analysis, it was only through actually existing socialism and not empty socialist rhetoric that a new social and economic synthesis could be developed. Given divergent historical, material, and social conditions and realities, countries needed to follow their own path to socialism. However, each path needed to be based on scientific method and explanation. Thus, the universal and common goals of socialism were to ensure the general welfare of the population and to free all people from colonial and imperial imposition. Further, discussion and debate at the conference emphasized the escalation of and support for liberation struggles in areas still subjected to colonial domination, and the importance of securing and protecting independent nations that staunchly opposed Western coloniality. Importantly, like the Fifth Pan-African Congress, the conference stressed that workers, peasants, mass action, and the involvement of ordinary people were essential to the success and political development of liberation struggles. This was not least because historically, capitalist exploitation rendered the ruling classes fundamentally incapable of recognizing the humanity of workers. And the ruling classes included like so-called comprador classes or endogenous bourgeoisies, who were basically the puppets of international capital. I call this in our contemporary moment the niggerati in relation to the Black bourgeoisie. Attendees also brought attention to and passed resolutions condemning US imperialism in Vietnam, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic, crises in Rhodesia and the Congo, continued military buildup and political repression in South Africa, and collaboration between NATO and Portugal against the revolutionary struggle for independence in Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, and Cape Verde. And in regard to the latter point, Amilcar Cabral stood out at this conference as a sort of leading figure and theoretician. So look him up, Amilcar Cabral. So again, we see here in this tri-continental formation, the ways in which solidarity, struggle, and liberation or self-determination or autonomy by any means necessary are stressed. And again, these are themes that cohere in the Black Studies movement. So in addition to these movements and these sort of conferences that I've described above, it is important to think about what CLR James called World Revolution 1968, given the magnitude of anti-systemic revolts that happened in that year. So contemporaneous with the struggle, with the rise in the struggle for Black studies, were a number of other uprisings and turn-ups, so to speak, right? And what's really important about the year, one of the key events in 1968 is the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, because it's kind of like, you know, even though MLK was radicalizing, he was still working more or less within the system. And so people were like, okay, so you gonna assassinate him when he's trying to work with y'all? Like, we want all the smoke. So everybody was turning up around the country and around the world, right? So for example, there were student uprisings in Senegal. And particularly on May 27, 1968, there was a strike and boycott of exams by students in Senegal who were protesting continued French imperialism. They were also protesting political, economic, and social crises in the country, as well as police repression and the expulsion of foreign students. And so a lot of the dynamics that were happening in the United States that were the impetus for the struggle for Black studies were also happening in Senegal. There were labor strikes. So for example, in May 1968, there were wildcat strikes throughout France, which represented both a cultural and social rebellion of 10 million workers that also helped to spark the women's and gay liberation movements there. And these workers' wildcat strikes were heavily influenced by third worldism, not least the thought of Mao Zedong, Che Guevara, and Ho Chi Minh. Likewise, we see forms of radicalism in sport. So it was at the 1968 Olympics where the Black Power protests of San Jose State University students Tommy Smith and John Carlos happened. You know, they raised the fist as they were receiving their medals, which were later stripped from them for that active protest. And also at that 1968 Games, we saw massive anti-apartheid campaigns to prevent South Africa's participation in those games. So all of that to say is that 1968 is a milieu of radical activism, of people protesting all of these systems of domination. And there's this feeling of optimism that like we could win, right? Because it's all of these forms of protests are happening all over the world, and the ruling classes are sort of back on their heels. Thus, I understand the Black Studies movement in relationship to Pan-Africanism, the Bandung spirit, third worldism, and tri-continentalism for a number of reasons. Not least of which, this moment was inaugurated by students and community-based demands for a more relevant education, which represented the intellectual expression of political Pan-Africanism in United States colleges and universities. So they're challenging the epistemological wing of imperialism, colonialism, and capitalist domination. Likewise, student agitation for a culturally legible education with utility beyond the ivory tower fundamentally challenged the imperialist, white supremacist, and bourgeois logics of the traditional disciplines. That is to say, they didn't want to just study like Chaucer and whatever else, right? They wanted a form of education that would allow them to develop and uplift their communities, and that had practical application. These students were fundamentally dedicated to the economic development of local and global communities, Black self-determination and racial equality. And they understood this within the context of an internationalist framework that connected African descendant struggles for liberation in the global North and in the global South. And this is why Black students, because they were drawing upon anti-imperial, anti-colonial, and anti-racist insurgencies in Africa, the Caribbean, and the global South, they used as a metaphor and an analogy the internal colony, right, or the domestic colony. So they began to theorize and understand and articulate themselves as internally colonized subjects. And finally, Black studies was envisioned as a space to confront the cultural apparatus of the United States and to counterbalance the historical effects of white cultural particularism parading as universalism that denied the validity of competing values, standards, and epistemologies, right? And again, these are all themes and ideas that are pervading these earlier formations of Pan-Africanism, Third Worldism, and Tri-continentalism, and Afro-Asian solidarity. So as such, the Black studies movement in the United States can be understood as a Black and Third World internationalist challenge to the color line with a specific focus on United States colleges and universities. Through its identification with decolonizing struggles in the Third World, it combined Black nationalism and Third Worldism to challenge the status and imperialist logics of traditional disciplines like sociology, anthropology, political science, and economics in the academy. Student activists define themselves in opposition to and in rejection of whiteness, Eurocentrism, capitalist individualism, and Cold War conformity. They sought to harness their education to eradicate white supremacy, to liberate themselves from economic dependence and social imposition, to create Black structures and institutions, to develop Black culture, to eviscerate class conflict within the Black community, and to serve the needs and solve the problems of the Black community and Black youth. In effect, they aim to create a revolutionary Black vanguard that would aid the masses in using all the tools at their disposal to end oppression. And so it's important to note here that these students who are engaged in this Black studies movement are using a variety of tactics and tools. And so these include sit-ins, petitions, demonstrations, picket lines, campus strikes, the formation of campus organizations like Black student unions, storming the stage during lectures and celebrations and graduations, issuing demands. So there's all of these lists of demands in the archives everywhere. They're going on hunger strikes. They're holding administrators hostage. They're creating systems of secret cells and codes to organize resistance and to avoid infiltration, because the FBI is infiltrating Black student unions, right? Anyway, so the FBI is infiltrating these formations, right? They're also getting groups of Black students to register for the same courses. And so this was a tactic used at Brooklyn College so that students can demand particular professors implement forms of knowledge that are relevant to them. And so if it is that these professors do not do this, then the students en masse can boycott that course. And they're taking over faculty meetings and seizing buildings. So these were all different tactics, among others, that students are using to bring their demands for Black studies and a more relevant education into fruition. These aims were part of a broader Third World consciousness. Strikes that erupted at San Francisco State College and the University of California, Berkeley in November 1968 and January 1969, respectively, for example, appended the struggle for an autonomous Black studies department to the struggle for a Third World college that addressed the lived realities of all oppressed groups in the United States. The strikes were led by Black, brown, red, and yellow students organized into Third World Liberation Fronts. The UC Berkeley Third World Liberation Front, for example, was comprised of the Afro-American Student Union, the Mexican-American Student Confederation, the Asian American Political Alliance, and the Native American Indian Association. And so here, it's also important to note the centrality of organization. So these are not just individual students turning up, although that's part of it. They're organizing themselves into disciplined, collaborative structures in order to be able to effectively make demands on the university. As was typical of Black and Third World internationalists, the Third World Liberation Fronts understood racism in US colleges and universities to be a product of the capitalist system bent on destroying third world human beings. As well, they argued that the struggle for these human beings, the struggle of these human beings for self-determination and educational freedom was part of the worldwide conflict against imperialism that could only be eradicated through revolutionary insurgency against oppression, war, inflation, recession, and racism. The third world strikes involved students, faculty, and community members who understood themselves as internally colonized peoples. As domestic colonies, they contended, resources, land, capital, and labor were controlled by persons living elsewhere, and white supremacist police forces and their racialized lackeys occupied these spaces through the use of extraordinary and arbitrary violence. Here, they drew upon third world liberation struggles, especially the struggle of the Viet Cong, as a defining political metaphor for their position as a colonized nation within a nation, giving their struggle an anti-imperial character. This was not least because they were reading the latest writings of third world revolutionaries, including Frantz Fanon, Malcolm X, Mircea Cabral, and CLR James. Like other third world internationalists in the 1960s, third world students were inspired by revolutions in Africa and Asia, by urban rebellions in US ghettos, and by excessive force used against oppressed people to support the idea of self-defense and guerrilla warfare. They also connected the use of police intimidation on campus to undermine the demands of strikers to the daily repression and reactions suffered by third world communities in battles for liberation. Additionally, student activists paid close attention to the plight of workers, both on campus and in surrounding communities. As such, the strikes had overwhelming support from unions like the American Federation of Teachers and the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, who were subjected to police brutality alongside students. Student agitation focused on political and economic redistribution, communalism and solidarity, the transformation of areas in which oppressed people were warehoused, and Black liberation in the US as part of the international fight against colonialism and imperialism. Regarding a more relevant education, they demanded a third world college with third world people in positions of power and control, third world leadership at all levels of the university, increased enrollment of and financial aid for students from oppressed populations, and community programs to foster the economic development of third world communities beyond the university. More broadly, they insisted upon the release of political prisoners, an end to the war against third world political groups, the withdrawal of forces from Southeast Asia, and the end of university complicity with war activities such as the Reserve Officers Training Corps, or the ROTC. Thus, the Black Studies movement adhered in a commitment to an unconditional end to racism, the right of all human beings to determine their collective destinies, and the seizure of economic, social, and political power from exploitative peoples and institutions in favor of people's power. So, they was getting it, right? Very radical, very revolutionary in this scope and aim. And this is I've glossed over the sort of conflicts within the struggle for Black studies. So there were absolutely liberal and bourgeois and even conservative elements who are also struggling. But we have to understand Black studies within the milieu in which a struggle against racism and a struggle against colonial domination were absolutely the ethos. And those are what those two things in particular are what structured the struggle for Black studies writ large. So if this was the founding ethos of the Black studies movement, what happened? The institutionalization of Black studies engendered a turn away from Pan-Africanism, internationalism, Black radical scholarship, and community and working class concerns. The struggle over redistribution was replaced by a struggle over representation and recognition. Culturalism, the regime of meaning making in which Blackness is culturally specified and abstracted from material, political, economic, and structural conditions of dispossession through state technologies of anti-radicalism, became the means of securing recognition and reward. History and literature became the two areas through which Blackness was studied, defined, and codified, and culture became the focus of anthropological and sociological studies of the Black condition. Political, economic, and structural understandings of the Black condition inside and beyond the United States became relegated to cultural specifications as Black studies became institutionalized and legitimated. By the 1990s, Pan-African internationalism had been replaced by diaspora, a culturalized, abstracted, and anti-essentialist conceptualization of connection, disjuncture, commonality, and difference among African descendants. So for any of you who are in Black Studies or have taken Black Studies courses, it's very much more likely that you've heard of African diaspora as opposed to Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism is considered to be like passe, old school, whatever, but this is a sort of political and epistemological turn, right? All right. In the reorder of things, the University and Pedagogies of Minority Difference, Roderick Ferguson analyzes the role of the academy in harnessing minority difference through reconstitution of capital and to the needs of the US state. He does so in the context of demands for inclusion by minoritized subjects on the one hand, and of the global entrenchment of US political and economic imperatives on the other. Ferguson argues that by the late 1960s, the academy had become the training ground for how the US state and capital ought to contend with the meaning, representation, and accommodation of minority difference. It was concerned with developing ways to combine tolerance for diversity with the imperatives of world order. Civil rights gains of the 1960s became manifested in changes in racial accommodation in and composition of the academy. The increasing presence of US minority groups was underscored by the growing presence of scholars from the Global South, partly as a consequence of the 1965 Immigration Act and the deracialization of immigration policy. With the rise of domestic and global minorities in the academy, disciplines that focused on specific races, ethnicities, global areas, and identities increasingly became sites of surveillance. The academy became a site of reactive crisis management that both accommodated and disciplined challenges to Eurocentrism, Euro-American coloniality, and white supremacy. While it incorporated new cultures, knowledges, and peoples, it did so in a way that produced new means of exclusion in the service of US empire. Through ethnic studies and Black studies, the state, by way of the academy, was able to reconstitute its pedagogy through the distribution of recognition and legitimacy. It transformed its power into, quote, it transformed its power in order to, quote, incorporate formerly marginalized and excluded subjects and societies, an ability signified through the extension of recognition and sovereignty for people who spent much of their histories under the colonial yoke, end quote, and an extension of recognition and rights for people who had hitherto been racialized and marginalized from citizenship. That's a quote from Roderick Ferguson. In the 1960s, ethnic studies and Black studies contributed to efforts by the United States to refashion itself as anti-colonial and anti-racist in order to legitimate itself as a world leader and to absorb heterogeneity. This was done in the context of the Cold War and in the context of a crisis of white supremacy. In effect, the US university serves a political function operating in relationship to the state, which is interested in maintaining the interests of empire over and against various communities which exist in this country that are committed to radical change. The university manages how disciplines are constituted, what areas of study are acceptable, which concepts become dominant and which are marginalized or eradicated, and which fields become the sites of surveillance, co-optation, and disciplining. These must be consonant with narratives of the nation. It is little wonder then that the academy became the site of the convergence between US global dominance, the imperatives of capital accumulation, and multiculturalism as a technology of discipline. The academy became the space in which demands for the reformulation of epistemological and cultural representation converged with the capitalist imperialist interest in difference. It provided the means by which state and capital developed its methods of representation and regulation. This period inaugurated a new intentionality in the university that, as an instrumentality of state and empire, needed to locate, know, accommodate, and affirm difference so that it could simultaneously legitimate and depoliticize it. Thus, while community activism, Pan-Africanism, and Third Worldism, as well as student demands for more relevant education, were responsible for the introduction of Black studies into the academy, and Black cultural nationalism, the movement it supported, its tendency and its ideology motivated the demand for Black studies programs, university administrators were determined to reshape Black studies into a purely academic phenomenon. The university was largely successful through its deployment of, quote, networks of power that worked through and with minority difference in culture to redirect originally insurgent formations and deliver them into the normative ideals and protocols of state, capital, and academy, end quote. And that's a quote from Ferguson. As the number of programs began to shrink considerably, from about 500 in 1971 to about 225 in 1984, the survival of Black studies programs came to rest on their ability to successfully perform a purely academic function. In order to be legitimated in the academy, Black Studies began to focus its scholarship and research on changing the perceptions about Black people as a basis of the potential impact of such changes on their social status. As Alan Colon writes, quote, "The struggle for conceptual legitimacy, which is the handmaiden of institutionalization, will be generally correlated with the perception and social status of Black people in American society," end quote. With this move away from counter-hegemonic struggle and activism, Black Studies succumbed to the institutionalizing ethos and became part of the imperial tendency of the US state to co-opt, manage, and ultimately undermine oppositional tendencies. As such, as St. Clair Drake argued, quote, when the Black Studies movement became institutionalized, its originality, potency, and relevance tended to be decimated, if not lost, despite the continuing impact of innovations associated with it, end quote. Black Studies moved toward being an intellectually valid, educationally responsive, and socially constructive project, which demanded little attention to class or anti-imperialism. This was accommodated and made possible in part by its move away from the community in its desire for legitimacy in the university. Relatedly, Manning Marable argues that the majority of Black Studies programs rejected political economy and public policy to focus on arts and humanities, creating an imbalance between literary and cultural studies and structural critique. As a consequence, Black Studies has generally ignored Black workers, the contribution of unions to fights for Black freedom, and has paid no attention to growing class polarization. In other words, the formalization of Black Studies instantiated a move away from class and community. Unfortunately, Black Studies scholars became largely irrelevant to efforts aimed at the implementation of policies that impacted the material realities of Black people. Black Studies did, however, provide an understanding of how Black people should be managed by the state, namely through discourses of multicultural rights that asserted equality in terms of cultural recognition. The perceived accomplishments of Black Studies, that is, its shift from a Eurocentric to an Afrocentric perspective, its cultivation of a new interest in Black life and culture, its revelation that African culture persisted in the United States, its acceptance of the US as a pluralistic society with multiple viable cultures, and its shift from a discourse of assimilation to one of acculturation in its efforts to understand the ways in which the dominant culture was being redefined, attest to its role in the management of Black people for their conscription into the nationalist agenda of the state. Through its enunciations of culturally coded Blackness, Black Studies became self-disciplining, creating the conditions for its institutionalization. Paradoxically, it created the conditions for its own destruction by asserting a superficial equality and representation that rationalized the eradication of ethnic studies and Black studies. Moreover, Black Studies became an instrumentality for the management of radical and potentially revolutionary movements, thereby helping the state, capital, and empire to rearticulate itself through incorporation, absorption, and regulation. The distortions produced by culturalist specifications of Black studies in the absence of critical political economy invisibilize and even negate the structural and material dynamics involved in the production, maintenance, and reinscription of Blackness over time and space. Further, the discipline evades and undermines the radical Black tradition by diverting research and scholarship away from the critical political economy and material conditions of Black abjection, dispossession, and exploitation. Notwithstanding the current state of Black studies, there is a cadre of scholars committed to reviving the radical Black tradition through a deep study of the conjuncture of Blackness, violence, neoliberal governance, racial capitalism, and debt as a technology of repression, and the ways in which these are specified through epistemology and pedagogy. Such interrogation of the conditions under which people are forced to live, labor, and operate on the one hand, and the forms of organization, fellowship, and motion necessary to combat alienation and exploitation on the other hand, requires a move away from the types of abstract idealism, culturalism, and anti-materialism that currently pervade the discipline. Luckily, we need only draw upon the history of the Black Studies movement to get back on track. Thank you.
I wish we were in person so you could hear us clapping and celebrating that excellent talk, Charisse. Thank you so much. We have about 14 minutes left, and I have a lot of questions, and I'm sure others do too, who are reading your articles for this session. Some things immediately come to mind that you spoke on. I really appreciate the way you centered the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in '68. April 4th, obviously, is an anniversary that just past that a lot of people were signifying and signaling. And I think the internationalist context you brought that in was really helpful. This painting is from a friend of mine that was produced in 1973 through the Organization of Solidarity of the People of Asia, Africa, and Latin America that Castro's government, supported, this broader kind of like aesthetic kind of support to this broader, political economic movement of OSPA, yes. But as you were speaking about 68, and I know we have a student on the call, a grad student, excellent grad student who's graduating this semester, who has been really thinking through 1968 in France. So I appreciate that turn too. But we need not look further than UL Lafayette, which does not have a Black Studies department or program, and kind of courses here and there in the 90s that I've heard from alum. But there was a recent article that pointed out of the 652 faculty members at UL, 5% are Black, right? In 1968, one of our professors in the history department, Michael Martin, wrote an article I was trying to find, and I'll find it and share with you all, about the student demonstration in response to MLK's assassination at UL, largely making similar demands that other Black students were making across the country, right? How they were met, how they were interpreted certainly wasn't the establishment of a Black Studies program. Nonetheless, I think we can still see a kind of university's evolution in response to Black student demands, not just at UL, but across the country. What for representation is my question for you. Students at UL are thirsty, understandably so, for Black faculty, Black administrators, folk who look like them, who might speak to their politics and experience and identity. I often say in my classes in history and Black studies, representation matters, but it won't save us. So clearly there is some relationship to this day in terms of representation within Black studies, despite the ways in which it has been kind of co-opted to depoliticize and legitimate certain pedagogy, certain epistemology, certain kind of liberatory vision. What's your thought on the politics of representation today within Black studies? I'll just keep it short, and then other folk, please, in the chat, throw in questions so that we can get some other engagement.
I think that what has happened with representation as class bifurcation has increased exponentially within the Black community is what I call like intersectional imperialism or identity reductionism, whereby what matters is only the body that somebody is in, right? And not their politics, not their commitments, not their vision of Black studies, for example, but simply that they are, for example, Black, woman, left-handed, neurodiverse, like the more sort of the more marginalized identities they occupy, the better. But this does not map onto any sort of liberatory praxis whatsoever. It can be that people who are, who occupy these multiple positions of marginalization and oppression are radicalized by that, but some are not. Some people simply want to be included in the status quo. And so I think we need to be mindful of that, especially now, because the conditions of possibility of Black studies in 1968 are not the conditions now. And so there are not the same types of counterweights. There's not the same ideological ethos. There's not the same ethical commitment to decoloniality, for example, and a sort of a socialist project, a radical liberatory project. It is a sort of representation and recognition has been effective. And the thing about that is that capital funds its own opposition, right? And this is opposition that can be co-opted. And so I think we need to be very mindful of that, right? My example is always Caitlyn Jenner, right? Who is a trans woman, but who is so incredibly reactionary because Caitlyn Jenner is rich. Caitlyn Jenner is part of the ruling class, right? And so we can't just look at people's identity. There's this quote, that one of my colleagues, Pierre, used in reference to Obama, but it was something like, the trees kept voting for the axe because, you know, the handle was made of wood and they thought it was one of them. So that's a sort of proverbial way of saying like all skin ain't kin. And we have to be even more vigilant and mindful of that. We cannot celebrate the Kamala Harrises of the world, the Amanda Gormans of the world, the Lloyd Austins of the world. These people are not for us, right? And to the extent that they're not enemies, that's debatable, but they're certainly not for liberation of the masses of oppressed working and poor people. And so we need to be mindful of that and just simply be specific with our demands, right? Because I don't think you want a Black provost or president to come in who is oppressive and who wants to further neoliberalize the university, right? Who wants to further take away, you know, access from students. Like that's not, just because it's a Black person doesn't make it oppression nonetheless, or Black or Latinx, Indigenous, whatever. And so I think we need to be very mindful of that.
Thank you, very helpful. First Black male educator I ever had was Dr. Horace Huntley, who was a student activist during the Black student movement at the University of Minnesota in '69. So I was fortunate that was my first experience, but that certainly isn't always the case in terms of representation, education, and politics. Thank you.
Yes, that proverb is said much more eloquently. Thanks, Brad. When the axe entered the forest, the tree saw the handle, it said, "It's one of us." Basically, that's the proverb.
So Leslie has a question that I can read aloud, and then you can respond. Leslie asks, is there a role for entities such as committees on diversity, equity, and inclusion in a context where there's no affirmative action, no hiring, et cetera, but only efforts to make people feel welcomed into a retrograde system?
Yeah, that role is reactive crisis management. The role is the maintenance of the status quo. The academy is we are the most, academics are the most meetingist, committee formingist, task force participatingist group ever. And that's a class politics. That's a class project to keep resources and expertise at the top without really actually doing anything about it. So I refuse to be on any DEI committees because it's whack generally. So.
Mark, thank you. Mark asks, in Black Studies in the Westernized University, you quote Dr. Malini Schuler to describe how multiculturalism came to represent a, quote, politics of cultural recognition without recognition of equal social reward, unquote. Could you say more about contemporary multiculturalism?
Yeah, I think contemporary multiculturalism is even worse because it's not only multicultural, but it's specified through class. So it's not only that you have these diverse bodies, but you have diverse bodies who essentially have the same ideology. So if you look at Joseph Biden's cabinet, for example, it's multicultural. It's the Rainbow Coalition of Imperialism. So you got Indigenous folks, you got Black folks, you got women, you got LGBTQ folks, but they all are committed to domestic and international imperialism. They are all committed to maintaining the status quo, and their whole sort of, politics is that they're not Trump. And so I think we need to be multiculturalism is important in terms of challenging Eurocentrism and Western hegemony, but it can't just be multiculturalism for multiculturalism's sake. There's nothing, again, objectively, in my perspective, there's nothing objectively revolutionary or counter-hegemonic about the celebration of culture. And in fact, it's often used to not have any redistributive or sort of broader transformative change, because it's like, everybody's, there's all these differences, let's celebrate all of this difference. And then so something like poverty becomes codified as different. So it's like, well, some groups are poor, some groups are rich. We all different, we just out here. And I think that that's a problem.
No, that's really helpful. If we have more time, I'd ask you about Sylvia Wynter's conception of the diselected to get at those multiple intersections of oppression without losing the politics associated with the terms of exclusion. Right. Amira asks, would you say that the purpose of all universities, colleges, including HBCUs, which we could think about too in this moment in 1968, I'm thinking about Southern, Jackson State, and Howard in particular, to reproduce the Black managerial class. How would you advise current and future Black students to avoid becoming a part of this class? Is the obsession of culture, sans political economy, and Black studies also due to the flattening of all industries/spaces? The academia or academic and entertainment, military industries seem to be fusing into one.
Yeah, I think that so neoliberalization pervades all industries and all sort of facets of society. Academia is an industry, right? Period. So I think that this is happening throughout the obsession of culture, or the ways in which both like culture and identitarianism become a stand-in for progress, right? That if we recognize these cultures and we include a particular what I call chips in the cookie, we have some chips in the cookie, then that reifies a sort of linear progress narrative that the more we move through time, the better off we are. And we know that this is absolutely not the case, not least because I think that, what is it, Gen Z or whatever is the first generation that will be doing less well off than their parents. And yes, I think that the purpose of colleges and universities, especially HBCUs, is to reproduce the managerial class. You need only look at the money. HBCUs are heavily, heavily funded by Coca-Cola and other corporations. Even the wife of oh boy, the ghoul, what's his name? The Amazon ghoul. His ex-wife donated all of
Bezos.
See, this is why you don't want to have that much money. That much money has eaten away the man, so he's literally Smeagol, for those who watch Lord of the Rings. And it's very horrifying. Every time I see him, I get very scared. But anyway, his wife gave all of this money to these historically Black colleges and universities, and that is not no strings attached money. They have economic interest in that, right? And we see some of the most reactionary people coming out of historically Black colleges and universities because of their class, because of the ways in which they want to be positioned in terms of class, or because of their already existing class position. This is why even there were Black studies struggles even at HBCUs, or struggles for a Black university. So what does it mean to have a struggle for a Black university at a historically Black college or university? It means that everything other than the melanated people on that campus are still Eurocentric and oriented toward white supremacy. So the Board of Regents, predominantly white, even professors at these colleges and universities were predominantly white. And even when they were not, the curriculum is predominantly white, right? And so in terms of how to advise current or future Black students to avoid being a part of this class, this is where ethics, so I always talk about ethics, epistemology, and politics, but this is where ethics becomes very important. We have to really unlearn the fact that having a lot of money is a moral good, and is a sort of, is a noble imperative. I think it's quite the opposite. The fact when people have egregious amounts of money in the billions or even in the millions, in my perspective, that means many, many people have nothing. And so we glorify these people because we assume that if they have a lot of money, they've worked hard, or they're good, or they're successful. Now, people who have no money must be lazy, or is a function of moral failure or of laziness. And we need to unlearn that, because if it is that we believe that being part of the ruling class is a good thing, this is what people will strive for, period. And so this has to do with, like, for those of us who are professors, like what we teach, how we teach, what are the examples that we use, who we lift up. And I think that that's really, really, really important. It's an ethical thing as well as a sort of political struggle. We have to reevaluate the ways in which we relate to each other, relate to ourselves, and relate to, like, our environment. Those are the ways in which we're going to encourage people to pursue endeavors that are sort of collective, collaborative, and people-centered, and not self-aggrandizing, and not for the reproduction of a particular class of people, which is ultimately false class solidarity, because the overwhelming majority of people are not in the ruling class. They are not capitalists. So it's false class solidarity. And so, yeah, so I think we need to teach that out of people, struggle that out of people, yeah.
Lord knows I don't have any capital. Anyway, Charisse, that was excellent. I think an excellent way to conclude the evening. I would ask that we give another round of applause. If we were in person, we can do so virtually, but I think you left us with a lot to think about, and this has been recorded, and we will upload these talks to the Gilboa Center for Public History for ongoing engagement with this work. I look forward to teaching it in an Intro to Black Studies class moving forward. and perhaps having you join to actually do the workshop work, to engage your work further. This Friday, we'll be having another working group meeting. At 5 o'clock, we'll be reading from LaTanya Autry and Ronaldo Walcott, who will be our final two speakers of this 6 speaker series next Wednesday and the Wednesday after that, same time, except one of them's at 4. Maria's, Ronaldo's at 4. And LaTanya's at 4. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so thanks again, Charisse, for the talk, and thank you all for participating and joining. We look forward to being in touch in the future, and I will see some of you Friday and many more of you next Wednesday. Take care.
Bye. Thank you for having me. Bye all.